Okay, that's it for our presentations. We have time for questions. We're running a bit behind in terms of the when we started today, so we'll see what the interest is in questioning. So we have microphones on the table here, so I think if you put your hand up, someone will give you a microphone and you can ask a question. While we look around for questions, can I start? I see one over here, but I'll start and then you can accumulate. But Tom, around your work in Nigeria, you were looking at this work about the markets and population growth, but West Africa is having a free trade zone, so what's going to be the impact of this big growth in Nigeria and how that growth might be met by the regional response rather than just in Nigeria itself? There's a microphone there. We might I don't know what the normal is here. Do you want to have a go at that while we get the next question? Okay, there's a microphone there.
Thank you, Peter. Yes, indeed. So the prospects for regional trade in West Africa are actually improving over this new free trade zone that is being created. And we see at least in the projections from the model, that there is quite a big influence on competitiveness of some sectors in Nigeria. And it's actually, if I just stick to the results from the paper, then it depends. So if we don't do anything, then there will be massive imports of especially livestock products into Nigeria, and that's partly to meet the domestic demand, and whether there is an opportunity then for pulses or for legume-based feeds in Nigeria to sort of be part of that mix of domestic production and imports is to be seen. I think there are quite a few interesting opportunities for interregional trade for pulses, at least, that make the best of the economic conditions in the area. So I really hope that this trade zone will stimulate regional trade and create further benefits for the region. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Tim. Tom, there's a question here at the front.
Yes, Jan Lowe from the International Potato Center. Thanks for all those excellent presentations. Two quick questions, one for Dominique, one for Thomas. Dominique, when I think of the word forest, I'm thinking of things that are traditional, that maybe you would have fruits from a traditional forest, but then sometimes you talk about trees and tree cover. So in your agricultural land assessment, are you including cultivated fruit trees as part of what you would call forest? Or, oranges, citrus, avocados, that kind of thing. Does that fall into the discussion that you had? Just a clarification. And Thomas, in your modeling, are you looking at your calories per land area in terms of your crop mix, in terms of calories per land area per unit time? Because I think as we see land intensification, the maturity period of different crops really becomes important. So are you addressing that? Thank you.
Dominic first.
Yes, so in this particular study, we didn't look at any reforestation or plantation forests or anything like that. So these landscapes were selected sort of because they demonstrated a particular transition. These is not representative of all transitions. They represented a transition from a traditional forest, from communities living in old growth forest to communities living in heavily agriculturally modified landscapes that used to be forest. So, yeah, there's nothing to do with that's an interesting thing. We couldn't in this study, but we think fruit trees are definitely part of the mix there. Yeah.
Thank you for the question. So first of all, this tool that we used is a really broad brush. Yeah, so you should look at it from the perspective of aggregate commodity groups rather than specific commodities. What we did with technology is that we have, over the projection period, assumed like a continuous trend in technology growth. That's yield per hectare for all the crops. There's a little bit of differentiation there. We use standard assumptions from shared socioeconomic pathways and other scenario exercises. But what we do see, so there is an increase in calories per hectare unit for any of the crops. What we do see, however, is that that's far from sufficient for meeting actually the calorie needs. So this is part of the hard landing scenario, is that if technology growth and intensification remains at the same pace, then we're entering basically a much more scarcity in the system than could be avoided with more intensification.
Okay. We have a question at the back there.
Hi, my name is Sudha. I have a question for Amadou and a comment for Francesca. Amadou, you mentioned that there was different rates of stunting in different rainfall regions. So I was just wondering, the stunting and the changes and all that, how much is that connected to the food systems, right? What are these communities consuming? Because maybe in a higher rainfall area, are they consuming more vegetable, more vegetable-based nutrients? And in the lower rainfall, is it more animal source foods? For Francesca, just a comment about millets. There are 9 different types of millets, at least consumed in India. And I mean, I think it's important because the water requirements are quite different across these varieties. And there are a couple that are actually significantly produced and consumed.
Okay.
If I understood the question is that why we have differences in terms of stunting between locations. Is that? Okay. Yes, one part of the answer, it's about how rainfall is distributed over time, but also what are the different patterns of rainfall. But it's not only the thing that matters. Yes, food system is an important thing that we need to consider, but we didn't in this paper. But what I can say also about it is, when you look at, for the case of Senegal, for example, stunting is a major issue in South. In South, because not only of food system, yes, the problem is also about food system, but also we see that in the South, there's a problem of access to basic social services, for example. And in the North as well, there is a huge problem about access to basic social services. It's about food system, but it's about also other things that we need to consider to really understand what are the effects on the stunting and the other indicators on malnutrition as well.
Francesca?
It's okay. I totally appreciate that point, and there's definitely some more research that needs to be done into the different varieties. Unfortunately, at the moment, we haven't been able to aggregate our water use, so if you have any, I'm happy to talk to you afterwards, and if you've got any tips, that would be really helpful. Thank you.
Okay, we have a question at the back here.
Hi, thank you to all the presenters. I'm Simone Passarelli with Harvard University. I also have a question for Francesca. I was wondering if you considered potential for gains in water use efficiency in the places that were in the places with the variation, since we know that water use efficiency is going to be highest when water is actually scarce, and there are more potential for gains in places where water is actually abundant and the water use efficiency is low. So do you consider that, and how might that affect your findings on trade as being the solution, when maybe we should just be improving the efficiency in places where there are gains? And do you think maybe trade could disincentivize trying to achieve those gains?
Yeah, so at the moment we haven't explored any scenarios or actually what the potential changes that could happen are, but there's definitely 2 things. One is that certain states like Punjab and Haryana have really efficient water use, but they're the ones with groundwater depletion. So it's not just a case of water efficiency sometimes, it's also, and that's where trade might have to come in, where they might need to import from other areas. But we are going to explore where yields are higher and therefore, lower, and therefore the water use is higher, and what yields, what we could do to improve yields in certain states. So there's a combination of scenarios that we're definitely going to explore. And I think, as with all cases, there's not one size fits all for each state, and that's something that's really important that's come out of our work in India. So and I appreciate that comment. Thank you.
Yeah, Amadou, you want to say something?
It's not very common to ask questions to the other presenters, as you are a presenter. But I would like to ask a question to Tom about the scenarios, especially for the evolution of technologies. In a way, don't you think that in the scenario we really estimate the evolution of trends of technologies? For example, when you take agriculture, I would see that scenarios underestimate the evolution of trends. For example, I have worked 2 years ago in a project on evaluating the impact of agriculture on impact of climate change on agriculture. And what were the scenario over the long term? It was about that we should see an increase in inputs such as fertilizers and so on. But when you look at now about technologies, you see that some technologies like drones have a huge impact. And maybe that we are underestimating. Don't you think that the evolution will be much faster than what we think?
Okay, thank you for the question. I'm perfectly fine to do it like this. Actually, I think you're right in the sense that we have, with this broad brush that we apply for technological change, we don't look at these discrete changes in technology. So like suddenly, this entering of digital technologies or drone technologies in agriculture is like a shift from one system to another system, and we don't really have, we're not able to model these discrete changes. However, what we do employ in the scenario is not just yields, but also total factor productivity. And what we see in our scenario is a lot of interaction between the agricultural technology and the labor technology. So in technical terms, we're introducing skilled labor into agriculture. And that skilled labor, we know in reality only comes when there is technology there. So we have a bypass for it, but indeed you're right that it would be that the push comes from these more advanced technologies in the system. Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, question here.
Hi, I'm Lucas Alexandrovich. I have a question for Megan.
Yes, go ahead.
Continue?
Yeah.
I have a question for Megan. I remember about a year ago there was some headlines about microplastic pollution being totally ubiquitous in kind of beer samples, bottled water samples, and everywhere. And I think most of the public think about plastics in terms of kind of retail and packaging. So I'm just curious, I know your review wasn't set up to kind of look at specific challenges and where the biggest problems might be, but were there any big surprises where you think, that there's kind of big problematic areas in plastic in different agricultural food stages that most people would not be aware about?
Can you just repeat the last bit? Any surprises in terms of...
Yeah, I guess because the public think about plastic pollution in terms of kind of retail stage. And I guess, did you find any other interesting problematic areas that most people would not be aware of where plastic is concerned in the food system?
Yeah, I think, in fact, there were lots of surprises, as I mentioned, namely being that a lot of the research focuses on agricultural production in the first place. But one of the surprises, we're not really, obviously, as I said, able to weigh up benefits and harms. However, one of the surprises was actually how much the research focused on potential beneficial uses of plastic at that level. And I think we were certainly expecting more on the harmful side. But yes, there were some interesting things to do with, like as I mentioned, fertilizer runoff, and also phthalates left in the ground and how that affects then subsequent crop growth. So I think maybe that's something that we don't think about is, okay, increases yield in the short term, but there's potential after effects that we haven't fully explored in terms of the long-term use of plastics at this level. So I think that was an interesting avenue that potentially I hadn't thought of before.
Okay, we have a question here.
Hi, I'm Anna Herforth, and my question is also for Megan. And I also just want to applaud you and Joe and your co-authors for bringing this issue to the Academy Week, because it's something that we haven't discussed here before and is so important in the food system. I wondered if you looked at all into the toxicology literature on the effects of phthalates and other compounds in plastics on human health, and if you have any recommendations for how that kind of work could maybe cross-sectoral linkages between, those communities and our community and food systems work, how those connections could be made.
Thank you very much. Yeah, interesting question for sure. Yeah, we have captured a lot of toxicology-related literature, and unfortunately I didn't quite have time to present it today. And that mainly came from the processing, storage, and transport stages. So focusing a lot on that packaging and, as you mentioned, also water content of different phthalates and things like that. And yes, I think it could be usefully employed at other stages as well. As I mentioned, only one study looked at phthalates actually in crops. So I think that might be a really interesting avenue to explore. And also using potentially different populations. It's quite difficult to obviously examine this in human populations, but what we're seeing is a lot of intermediate effects that maybe need to be explored kind of to a fuller extent, not just resting on the content of crops or drinks and things like that, and seeing how they actually are behaving and what onwards effects they have. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to have to call it. I know there's more questions out there, I'm sorry, but we're running over time. My quick reflection on this session is that as an older agricultural scientist that did agricultural science and was just interested initially in the career around productivity and pre-farm gate, what we can do there, this narrative that you see now around agriculture, health and nutrition is really important. It has an impact on the research that we do in the CGIAR, and I know that this program is partly supported by our CRP program on that, but it flows through to all of our research. ICRISAT leads a program around grain, legumes and dryland cereals, agri-food systems, and so it's very important, and it's great to see the research that's being done here that's contributing to that whole value chain and the impact. So join me in thanking our excellent presenters here this morning. I'm sure you'll have the opportunity to catch up with them over morning tea and to progress any further questions. I'll hand back to our MC. So thank you very much. Thanks, guys.